They're calling for a stopping of U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Do you support that legislation?
We're going to react to Saudi Arabia, and they're doing a consultation when they come back, and we will take action.
The White House weighs its options as members of Congress threaten to freeze all U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia, following the decision by OPEC Plus countries to cut oil production despite mounting U.S. pressures and rising inflation just weeks before crucial midterm elections. Hello and welcome to Inside America. I'm Ghida Fakhry. The decision earlier this month by the Saudi-led OPEC Plus to cut oil production by 2 million barrels a day starting in November, despite the Biden administration's intense lobbying efforts, has prompted threats of retaliation against Saudi Arabia from Democrats in the U.S. Congress who are calling for a one-year freeze on all arms sales to Riyadh.
We provide so much, not just in weapons, but in defense cooperation and joint defense initiatives to the Saudis. They get almost 73% of their arms from the United States. If it weren't for our technicians, their airplanes literally wouldn't fly.
In the last decade, Saudi Arabia, which is the world's largest single importer of weapons, has bought more than $70 billion in weapons from the United States. Now, the U.S. is the world's largest arms exporter, with foreign military sales averaging around $47 billion in fiscal year 2021. Saudi Arabia accounts for almost a quarter of all U.S. arms sales. As the U.S. Congress continues to weigh its options, the move by Saudi Arabia and other OPEC Plus countries to cut oil production has been widely seen by Democrats on Capitol Hill as an attempt to influence the outcome of the November 8th midterm elections in favor of Republicans by driving up gas prices in several key swing states. The Saudi Foreign Ministry denied any political motives, saying the unanimous decision by all 23 member states was, quote, based purely on economic considerations. It also claimed that the Biden administration sought to postpone the OPEC Plus decision for a month until after the midterms. Now, the White House denied that domestic politics were a factor and accused members of OPEC Plus of supporting Moscow.
We believe by the decision that OPEC Plus made last week, there certainly are aligning themselves with Russia. And right now, this is not a time to be aligning with Russia.
The decision to cut oil production has also been widely seen as a direct rebuke to President Biden, who, after vowing to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state during the 2020 presidential campaign, met with the Saudi Crown Prince in Riyadh last July in a bid to ramp up oil production and control soaring energy prices ahead of the midterms. This has prompted calls to reshape the decades-old U.S.-Saudi security relationship. But just how far will the U.S. administration and Congress go in re-evaluating the 75-year-old strategic partnership? Joining me now to discuss this is Gerald Feierstein, who served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs in the Department of State under President Obama. He is a former U.S. ambassador to Yemen and currently director of the U.S. Arabian Peninsula Affairs Program at the Middle East Institute here in Washington. Ambassador Feierstein, Democrats in the Senate and the House are threatening to halt U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. But haven't we heard this before? There have been similar proposals for years. They never pass in the U.S. Congress. What's different this time? Is it really a no-turning-back moment in U.S.-Saudi relations? Or just one more fracture that quickly heals a minor bump in the road?
Well, I think that it's a reflection of the anger that many felt here in the U.S., including in the administration, over the OPEC Plus decision that was seen again here in the U.S. as having a political message as well as an economic one, and one that was meant perhaps to undermine the president on the eve of the midterm elections here, and also, of course, complicates the efforts that the United States and our European allies have made to try to hold Russia to account for its aggression in Ukraine.
But as you know,
And so,
the Saudis deny that this was politically motivated. They say it was based purely on economic considerations. They also point to the fact that it was a decision reached by all 23 members of OPEC plus. President Biden, though, still said there would be consequences. Let's be honest, though. Would the U.S. really forego the billions of dollars in weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, as some members of Congress are hoping, or even take any other drastic measure that would hurt America's own economic, military, and geopolitical interests?
well, I think that that's actually the key question, and that is that the immediate reaction was that we should cut off arms sales, we should cut off our security relationship with the Saudis. But we maintain that relationship because it serves U.S. interests as well as Saudi interests. It's not in our interest or anyone else's interest to make Saudi Arabia and Saudi oil facilities more vulnerable to outside attack, either from the Houthis in Yemen or from Iran. So I think, in my view, that looking at the security relationship is the wrong place to look. What the U.S. should do is accelerate the kinds of measures that were included in the Inflation Reduction Act to speed up our transition away from dependence on fossil fuels. That would be the way to address the concerns over OPEC plus decisions.
But why not focus on the defense relationship? I mean, you served as U.S. ambassador to Yemen when President Obama was in office in 2010, when he authorized a record $60 billion arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It was seen as the biggest arms deal in U.S. history. The package, as you know, included dozens of fighter jets, Black Hawk helicopters that would be used in the Saudi-led bombing of Yemen. There was a pause in 2016 to some arms sales, but it was not the cutoff that many people had hoped for. In fact, the Obama administration offered Saudi Arabia more than $150 billion in weapons and other military equipment, the most of any previous administration. So clearly, supplying Saudi Arabia with weapons is far more important to the U.S. than holding it accountable for any human rights violations. And this mutually beneficial relationship hasn't really changed. And the Saudis know that, don't they?
Well, I think that the key point to keep in mind is that we share with the Saudis the same perspective on a number of issues in the region, a number of issues related to security and stability in the region. Again, the Saudi intervention in Yemen, which was agreed by the Obama administration, there was discussed, and there was a shared perspective that intervention to prevent a Houthi takeover of Yemen was an appropriate response. We can disagree, and we can be unhappy with the way some of those actions have been implemented over these last number of years. But the fact of the matter is that the Saudis are pursuing an objective in Yemen that we agree with, and that the international
Hold on. How can you say this,
with.
Ambassador Feierstein, when, as you know, tens of thousands of civilians were killed and coalition planes continued to be allowed to refuel their aircraft, which was central to their bombing campaign? How can you say that you shared the same perspective?
Because the single entity that is responsible for the civil war in Yemen is the Houthis. It's not Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia didn't intervene in the issue in Yemen for months after the Houthis attacked Sana'a, overthrew the legitimate government there, and launched an aggressive campaign to try to seize control of the entire country.
Hold on, Ambassador. We're talking about bombing campaigns that were facilitated by the United States through all of the weapons that the Saudis were receiving from the U.S., not to mention the refueling that they were getting as well, which allowed them to continue bombing civilians indiscriminately. I mean, Amnesty International has documented this. So have many others.
Well, again, I think that we can be unhappy about some of the actions that the Saudis have taken to implement their strategy in Yemen. There have been unfortunate incidents of civilian casualties, but I think that, to assert that the Saudis have indiscriminately attacked civilian targets is not correct. I don't think that
But is
there
it
is
correct to call
any
them
evidence.
unfortunate incidents? They're not one-off incidents, are they?
Well, again, I think that in a conflict like this, and you can look at the U.S. experience in Afghanistan, you can look at other kinds of experiences. Unfortunately, sometimes these things happen, and they happen in any conflict situation. But the issue is whether or not we agree with the Saudis that the way to resolve the conflict in Yemen is to prevent the Houthis from taking over and to force a political resolution. And there's no disagreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia about that.
But so if the US has and continues to put its own security interests, its partnership with Saudi Arabia above any other moral considerations, what chance is there for the relationship to be reevaluated, for anything here to change in any significant way?
Well, again, I think that looking at the security relationship is the wrong place to look. I think that there are other things that the United States should be doing. I think that we should be accelerating our own shift away from dependence on fossil fuels and increasing the use of renewables and other kinds of technologies so that once the world is no longer dependent on fossil fuels, that changes the dynamic. It changes the dynamic with OPEC plus. That's the place that we should be looking to make a change in the relationship with Saudi Arabia, not to attack the security and stability of the region in order to, salve people's anger.
Let me ask you finally, how much is all of this driven by the war in Ukraine? Because a spokesman for the National Security Council said this. He said, quote, "We are reevaluating our relationship with Saudi Arabia in light of these actions and will continue to look for signs about where they stand in combating Russian aggression." Let's face it, though. Let's face it, is this really what this is all about, or is it about the midterms and America's diminishing influence following what has been widely seen as President Biden's humiliating U-turn after he vowed to marginalize Saudi Arabia and had to backtrack?
Well, I think that Ukraine has a lot to do with it. Certainly, I think that there is a view here in the U.S. as well as in Europe that the Russian aggression in Ukraine is a very significant break with the international, order that's been in place ever since the end of the Second World War, and that we look to our friends and partners around the world to share with us a commitment to push back on Russia and to help support Ukraine. Interestingly, of course, as you know, the Saudis, perhaps a little bit surprised about how strong the reaction to OPEC Plus has been here in the U.S., have taken some steps over the last few days to try to balance their approach to the Russian aggression. There was outreach from the Crown Prince to Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. There was a commitment by the Saudis to provide $400 million in humanitarian relief. And there was also a reassertion by the Saudis that they support the elements of the UN Charter that basically call for respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states.
Sure, but
so
at the
they've
end,
done a number of
at the end of the day, though, at the end of the day, is it all going to be all talk and little action, let's face it, on Capitol Hill? Because Washington knows that Russia and China will be all too eager and ready to fill any vacuum left by the US in the region.
Well, again, I think that what the United States needs to do is to look at the things that are in the best interest of the United States. And I would say that what's in the best interest of the United States is to continue our transition away from a dependency on fossil fuels and to do other things. But to cut off security assistance to Saudi Arabia, which is an important element of overall regional stability, is cutting our nose to spite our face. And I do hope that as tempers cool and as people look at these issues more rationally, that they will back away from that and recognize that there are areas where we cooperate with the Saudis, where U.S.-Saudi relationship is important, for American interests and continue to do those things, and to look at other areas where we can reduce the overall relationship and pursue U.S. interests other ways.
All right, Ambassador Gerald Feierstein, thanks very much for sharing your perspective. Thanks for being with me. In response to OPEC's decision to cut oil production, the U.S. Department of Energy announced that it will release an additional 10 million barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve next month, continuing a policy that started 6 months ago. The U.S. is the world's top oil producer, but relies on foreign imports to meet its increasing domestic demand. The top 5 sources of crude oil imports in 2021 were Canada, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Colombia. Saudi Arabia has reaped record profits on oil sales this year, with prices hitting $102 per barrel at the end of August, before falling to $90 per barrel at the end of September. Prices are rising again, approaching $100 per barrel, with price hikes in key states like California, Nevada, Arizona, and Ohio, lifting the national average higher. With rising gas prices and less than 3 weeks before voters head to the polls in midterm elections, Republicans look poised to gain full control of Congress, according to recent surveys. A new poll gives Republicans a 49 to 45% majority among voters, who say their main concerns are the economy and rising inflation. So what impact will higher prices at the gas pump have on the Democrats' efforts to keep their slim majorities in Congress? And what does the OPEC Plus decision mean for U.S. energy policy? Elgie Holstein is a former chief of staff at the Department of Energy. He served as special assistant to the president for economic policy in the Clinton administration and as senior director for strategic planning with the Environmental Defense Fund. Elgie Holstein, how much of a bind are Democrats in as energy prices continue to climb with weeks until the midterms? What is their best strategy?
Well, first, I think it's always been the case that prices at the pump, so to speak, are a major political factor here in the United States, as they are around the world. People notice it. It has a direct effect on their wallets, if you will. They know that it affects the inflation rate overall. So it gets a lot of political attention. I think the best strategy for Democrats is to keep pointing out that we are doing many, many things now in the United States to move our country away from this dependence on fossil fuels. After all, we've been in this bind since 1973. And I think many observers believe, including us, that we can take steps now to start, for example, electrifying transportation. Those are the strategies that I think will be good for Democrats.
But isn't this more of a medium, long-term strategy? Top Republicans in the House Energy and Commerce Committee in the U.S. Congress are saying that the Biden administration should actually increase oil production to lower prices, not move away from fossil fuels.
Well, that's a medium and long-term strategy also. If we were to somehow or another magically increase our domestic production, we probably wouldn't see the impact of that at the pump in terms of the prices that people pay for gasoline for many months and in some cases years. So I think that the near-term quickest action we can take is pretty much what the administration is doing, which is releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to put more on the market, as well as conserving, and that's happening as well.
It's a heated debate between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans have been critical of Biden's energy policy for a while. Some in Congress are saying that there should be a ban on U.S. oil exports. Others are warning against it, but should a ban be taken off the table? What are the consequences, the negative consequences of a ban?
You know, we have had a ban on exporting oil once or twice in the past, and it tends to create dislocations in energy markets that are undesirable. And so we're probably better off moving oil around the world where it's needed, when it's needed, And I think that policy should probably remain in place. If, however, the Biden administration decides that it wants to support that kind of effort in Congress, I don't expect it to happen anytime between now and the election, certainly.
How do you see the OPEC Plus decision to cut output? The White House called it short-sighted. Do you agree? They say it's political interference and a way to help Russia in its war in Ukraine. But is that really the case? Or did the interests of Saudi Arabia and the other oil-producing countries simply overlap with Russia's when it comes to oil?
Well, clearly the Saudis are interested in building and maintaining their relationship with Russia, particularly when it comes to worldwide oil supplies. And those nations are critical in terms of the international balance of oil supply and demand, and therefore prices. So I think it's highly disappointing, given that the United States has reached out a friendly hand to Saudi Arabia and other countries, but it's all become quite complicated because of Russia's illegal incursion into Ukraine. And this complicates things tremendously and complicates the relationship, as I'm sure your viewers understand. So,
but hold on, but was it a cold economic calculation based on a shared interest in high oil prices?
It's hard to know how much of the decision made by OPEC Plus is driven by economics, that is to say, Russia's need for more foreign currency in order to pay for its war, or how much it's being driven by other political considerations. Very difficult to know in the short term exactly how all of that shakes out. And I suspect that there are several motivations, both with respect to Russia's interests and Saudi Arabia's interests, as well as the other nations within OPEC.
If one of the motivations was political, was it more than a bet on Russia? Was it a bet on Republicans winning control of Congress and possibly paving the way for a Trump presidency in 2024, as some are suggesting?
Republicans are just as concerned, just as angry about the decision made to raise oil prices as the Democrats are. Yes, they may be trying to blame it on President Biden, but they're not happy about it either. Why? Because they know that it has a direct impact on American and indeed worldwide inflation. And so I think—
But it's also going to help them in the midterms, isn't it?
I think it may help them in the midterms. It's possible if they succeed in blaming Joe Biden somehow for this decision made by OPEC Plus. If they can blame Joe Biden for higher gasoline prices. But frankly, between now and Election Day, I don't expect gasoline prices to go up very much. So this may end up being a debate that we have and an economic impact that we have, but not until after the election.
All right, Elgie Holstein, former Chief of Staff at the Department of Energy. Great pleasure to have you. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The decision by the Saudi-led OPEC Plus earlier this month to cut oil production despite the Biden administration's strong objections and intense lobbying has shown America's diminishing influence over its once reliable ally and its limited leverage in dictating OPEC energy policy. With a unanimous decision by all 23 member states to cut oil production by 2 million barrels a day, OPEC Plus sent Washington a powerful message that its economic and political interests come first. Despite Washington's efforts to isolate Russia, the US's other Gulf partners have continued to engage directly with Moscow. The leaders of the UAE and Qatar both recently met with President Putin in a show of public defiance. But while other OPEC countries have shown their willingness to lean away from the US orbit, it is the Saudi stance that is being seen by many here in Washington as the ultimate betrayal. Democrats in Congress are urging a re-evaluation of the US's strategic and defense relationship with Riyadh. But with Saudi Arabia accounting for almost 25% of all US arms sales, it is unlikely to be the turning point some lawmakers hoped for. And so, in short, despite the bombastic rhetoric on Capitol Hill and calls for retaliation against Saudi Arabia, these threats will likely amount to very little. Not only would they deprive Washington of its key client and lucrative arms deals, but they would also jeopardize the flow of oil and gas while pushing Riyadh deeper into the arms of Russia. And that, for Washington, may ultimately be a price too high to pay. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team. Thanks for watching.